December 8th, 1980, John Lennon is shot outside the Dakota building in New York City. The world stops. Radio stations play Beatles songs on repeat. Fans gather in Central Park, lighting candles, holding vigils. Within hours, some people start blaming someone else. Not Mark David Chapman, the man who pulled the trigger, not the obsessive fan culture that had stalked John for many years, not the media circus that turned his life into a spectacle, but Yoko Ono. Because for more than a decade, the world had already decided Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles. Here's the thing, none of it was true. But the truth at the time didn't matter. The story was too good. The villain was perfect. An older, artistic, different type of woman that didn't fit in with the rock star girlfriend that the rock star girlfriend was supposed to like. And so for 50 years, Yoko Ono became one of the most hated women in music. She was mocked and blamed and dismissed. All until recently, until the story started to shift, until people began asking, wait, did she actually do anything wrong? Or was she just the easiest person to blame? I'm Mark Di-Toro, and for 20 years I've worked with some of the world's most successful brands and impressive individuals. And today we're dissecting one of the longest running character assassinations in modern history, how a pioneering artist was turned into a cultural villain, how misogyny and fan obsession created a myth, and how slow, painfully, Yoko Ono's reputation is finally being rewritten. So let's start with what most people believe. Yoko Ono seduced John Lennon. She manipulated him. She isolated him from his friends, apparently. She sat in on Beatles recording sessions where no outsider had ever been allowed. She whispered in his ear. She drove a wedge between the band. And that's the story. That's what people like to believe. It's been repeated for decades. It's in books, documentaries, internet forums, and was the narrative in pubs across the country. But here's what actually happened. Yoko Ono was already an established avant-garde artist when John Lennon walked into her gallery exhibition in London in 1966. She didn't chase him, he pursued her. The Beatles were already fracturing. Business disputes, creative clashes, egos colliding. Paul and John had been at odds for many years. George Harrison had literally quit the band during the Get Back sessions you may have seen on Disney+. Ringo walked out during the White Album recordings, so issues that many bands face. So in a way, the breakup was inevitable, but it was easier, so much easier to blame the woman who happened to be there when it all fell apart. And that's the heart of this episode, not whether Yoko Ono was difficult or strange or unconventional, but why her reputation became the lightning rod for something she didn't cause, and how half a century later we finally see the truth. So who was Yoko Ono before John Lennon? Born in 1933 in Tokyo to an aristocratic family, banking dynasty, enormous wealth. She studied philosophy and music, moved to New York in the 50s, and became part of the avant-garde art scene. I actually went to see her recent exhibition in Tate Modern, which was incredible, displaying all of her work across the decades. And by the 60s, she was exhibiting conceptual art alongside people like John Cage and performing groundbreaking work in the Fluxus movement, as it's called. In her 1964 piece, Cut Piece is now considered iconic. She sat on a stage and invited the audience to approach her with scissors and cut off pieces of her clothing one by one, decades ahead of her time. And really, I don't think she was this groupie around musicians. It wasn't really her. She was serious, a respected artist. And when John Lennon attended her exhibition, he realized that this was someone special. And actually, she had no idea. She had no idea who he was, and he was intrigued by her work, especially a piece called Hammer at Nail, which invited viewers to hammer a nail into a wooden board. And John asked if he could hammer an imaginary nail, and she said yes. And that was the beginning of their relationship. And then John pursued Yoko. But the British press potentially saw it in a slightly different way. Rather than a meeting of minds, maybe they saw it as a threat. And then in the late 60s, early 70s is when the scapegoating begins. By 1968, John and Yoko were inseparable. The British tabloids went into overdrive. Headlines like John's mysterious Japanese girlfriend. She was described as Dragon Lady, Oriental Temptress, leading John astray. She was about 7 years older than him, which is something the press really zoned in on. And the fans, potentially, well, some of the fans were worse. Many had idolized John for many years. And then inside the band, that caused what was this inevitable tension. But perhaps the tension was John's doing, not Yoko's. He was the one continually trying to push the boundaries. And then in 1970, Paul McCartney announced he was leaving the Beatles and the band was over. And then within hours, the narrative started to shift between the Beatles breaking up and Yoko Ono breaking up the Beatles. So what about the rebuild? So how do you rebuild a reputation when the entire world has decided you're the villain? For Yoko, the answer was you don't right away. You keep working, you create, and you survive through the moment. In the 70s, John and Yoko made lots of music together, experimented, achieved top chart singles, but she kept creating and performing and doing, creating conceptual pieces, producing films, sometimes starring in films. Then in the 80s, something shifted. John and Yoko released Double Fantasy, their first album together. And it was a comeback, mature, reflective, and was praised by the critics at the time. And for a brief moment, it felt like the redemption was beginning. And then on December the 8th, 1980, John Lennon was murdered. Overnight, Yoko went from villain to grieving widow, with a brief window of sympathy, it seemed at the time. So, but then for many decades after that, the status quo then remained. So through that period, up until the 2010s, something started to change. First, the art world began to take her seriously again. Major museums hosted Yoko Ono retrospectives, the Museum of Modern Art, the Tate. I was recently at the Tate Modern only about a year ago. Critics reassessed her early work and realized she'd been pioneering conceptual art long before it was actually fashionable. Then in 2012, Paul McCartney did something crucial. In an interview, he said plainly, she didn't break up the Beatles broke up the Beatles. And it was the first time one of the band members had publicly and equivocally defended her. And it mattered because, sadly, it took someone deeply involved in the event, in the process, to validate her innocence, if you like, before the mainstream believed it. And then younger generations who are discovering the Beatles in later life would question, well, wait, what did she actually do wrong? And then in 2023, the surviving Beatles used recordings Yoko had preserved of John's voice, isolated from old demos to create one final Beatles song, Now and Then. Almost like a full circle moment. But where does Yoko Ono's reputation stand now? In art circles, she's recognized as a pioneering conceptual artist, influential and ahead of her time. In music, her experimental work is now cited as an influence on punk and new wave and electronic music. She's become a bit of a symbol of how women can often be scapegoated, but of how powerful myths can be and how long it can take for the truth to then surface. And Yoko Ono spent 50 years as a villain in many people's eyes for something she didn't really do. Sometimes the myth is more satisfying than the truth itself. So let's dig into the psychology, as we like to do in lots of these episodes, and how this actually played out in a public sphere. René Girard conceptualizes this with the scapegoating theory. French philosopher studied how groups under stress need a sacrificial victim to restore unity. When things go wrong, communities look for someone to blame, ideally someone on the margins, someone different, someone who can't fight back effectively at the time. Yoko was that perfect person in that moment. Unconventional, foreign, she didn't fit the mold during that period. Blaming her allowed Beatles fans to preserve the fantasy that a band could have stayed together if only she hadn't interfered. It's irrational, but it works, and unfortunately, that's often how scapegoating works. Then there's the halo effect, but in reverse. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where one negative trait colors everything else about a person. Once people decided Yoko was bad, everything she did was interpreted negatively. Her art, pretentious, her grief, performative, her business decisions were greedy, her silence, suspicious. That's how things were perceived. But it didn't actually matter what she did. The lens was set on that. And confirmation bias then would take over. And then as we get through that period, the rehabilitation through time starts to happen. Historical distance allows for the reappraisal. New generations don't carry the same emotional investment. They can look at the evidence more objectively. Archives open, interviews surface. The truth becomes a bit harder to ignore once the heat of the emotion abates. But Yoko's vindication didn't happen overnight. It took 50 years, but it did happen. Then there is probably a case of the male ally problem, which is very frustrating. It took Paul McCartney's endorsement for people to believe her innocence. Yoko had been saying she didn't break up the band for decades, but it fell on deaf ears in the large part. Paul says it's in 2012, and it has quite considerable impact. So what can we learn from Yoko Ono's story? In life, in business, if you're scapegoated, here's what you can remember and try and use. I'd say don't chase immediate vindication. In Yoko's example, she spent decades just continued working, experimenting, building that body of work that would speak for itself over time, and that worked. Let your work do the rebuttal, or be the rebuttal. Her art, as said, is now across some of the biggest and most impressive, prestigious museums in the world. That matters more than any tabloid headline ever did. And time is an ally if you can endure it. Old narratives eventually get interrogated by new generations, but you have to survive long enough to see that. Document the truth. What Yoko did very well was actually save letters, recordings, evidence. When the reassessment came over time, the facts were then there. And you can't control the villain edit, but you can outlast it. And sometimes that's the only victory available. Time and outlasting that perception. So, as part of the format with these with this new series is, would we rewrite it or no rewrite? What's the verdict? What would Yoko do? Well, for me, there are parts that I would suggest could be rewritten, And here's why. I think the Beatles could have a bit sooner come out and said some of the real reasons why the band split up. They, in the large part, stayed silent. And Yoko spent, I would assume, many years suffering for something she didn't do for a period of time. At the start, anyway, her career was overshadowed. Her art was dismissed. So it took time to get through that. And vindication is now very powerful and is correct. But it's a huge case study for scapegoating. And no one should have to wait half a century for the truth to catch up. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments or DM me your thoughts. I read everything. Talk soon.